this video, I'll be building this 2-foot by 2-foot miniature medieval city diorama, inspired by the city of Venice with its many canals and bridges. The key feature that I needed to sort out before tackling the project was how to make all the many little houses. We'll be working in 10mm scale, or 1/160th for this project. This type of scale is often used in model railways and some war games such as War Master or Kings of War. Well, how was I going to make 50 plus houses in a reasonable amount of time? Well, 3D printing, of course. I initially set about finding a set of pre-made models that I could just print and get going, but this proved difficult. Most models I found didn't suit my purpose, as they were meant to be printed at 28mm scale with playable interiors, or they just didn't fit the aesthetic. The ones I did find lacked enough detail or variety, or they weren't from the correct time period. So I set out in creating my own. Brushing up on my Blender skills, I made a set of models that I could smash together and remix to get different variations of houses. I found some public domain Blender assets as well, and in the end I had about 10 or more different house variations that I could then combine together into block-like structures with multiple levels, different gabled roofs, and a lot of crispy detail that would print well at 10mm scale. All the files I made will be available, linked in the comments as well, so if you have a similar project or want to follow along, you can do so. Alright, now to print all these out. I used both resin and FDM printers. And the resin printers came out much crisper, as expected, and actually much faster as well. I'd say about 70% of the houses ended up being resin printed, and only some of the larger blocks were FDM printed. Because of the 10mm scale, we're able to really leverage the resin printer for this project. Now that we have all these tiny houses, it's time to figure out how they go together. I wanted to manipulate and try placement out in real life, as you get much better sense of scale and dimension than in a modeling program that way. Something about the tactile nature of my brain, I guess. Here, I also decided where the canals would go, drawn in with a Sharpie directly on the MDF board. My hardware store sells these pre-cut 2-foot by 2-foot sheets for about $5 to $7. Not bad. For some raised elevation on the canal banks, we're going to be using XPS insulation foam, cut to size. I used a hot wire table for getting these to size, but a sharp utility knife works well too. XPS is a great material for this type of construction, since it takes carved details very well. For example, I was able to carve stairs leading down to the water level using an X-Acto blade, just making methodical cuts and removing material, sculpting in details like bricks along the way. Now I could have totally spent the time and carved every detail into the XPS foam, but I decided to leverage another piece of tech I have to get going with the project. I found a brickwork and cobblestone pattern searching Google Images and set to laser engraving that onto some EVA foam, or craft foam as it's also called. I come from a background in software development, and I usually try and automate most repetitive tasks when I can. While the laser was busy carving this repetitive pattern, I could advance with the project in other ways, like making sure you hit the like button on this video and subscribe if you want to see more content like it in the future. To stick the pattern down to the canal banks, I used tacky glue and some toothpicks or bobby pins. These make sure the pattern stays how I place it while the PVA glue dries. Then, after it had all dried, I was able to stick the raised areas down with some construction adhesive. Alright, with the land masses fixed in place, let's set about making some bridges connecting them. Cutting some smaller chunks of XPS foam, tracing out a shape that spans across 2 banks. No measuring here, just eyeballing it on the spot. And once this shape is cut out, I set about carving brick texture onto the side and adding some guardrails with some thinner pieces of XPS glued in. Cobblestone texture on top will be another piece of EVA foam textured with the laser engraver. To get some wood bridges, we'll be using some heavy cardstock or chipboard and coffee stir sticks. Cut to size and placed along this arch, we're able to get this wood plank look spanning across the bridge. Then, grabbing some paper straws and barbecue skewers and toothpicks, we can add the rest of the details of the bridge. Let's add some more elevation across the city as well, cutting some thinner slabs of XPS foam and carving ramps and stairs where it felt appropriate. Now it's starting to look a bit more interesting. These areas jutting out of the canal banks also break up the smooth lines of the river and make the canals look like they've had work done to them over the years. Using the same technique as the wooden bridge, I also made some smaller boardwalks and walkways that will serve as docks for the canal. These will be glued in later. And hey, as long as we're 3D printing houses, let's 3D print one more bridge as well. Before moving further, we're going to use some joint compound and black gesso mix to give the bottom of the canal and walls a consistent base coat and seal any cracks from our assembly process. It's going to be harder to get these areas painted later, so getting a black base coat will help a lot in the long run. Inspired by Max Minis over on Instagram, I wanted to add a series of lights that would make the city come alive at night. With that in mind, this seemed like a good time to run all the wires under the buildings before everything got in the way. Fun fact, Venice has power, communication, and pipes running through its bridges in a similar way as we're doing here. I'll show you another way to run wires for a board like this later on when I decide to add more lights. Using scavenged Ethernet wires here, where the color of the wires actually helps me stay organized. I know the colored wire will be the positive lead and the negative will be the white. And 3 different colors for 3 different districts. Easy peasy. I solder all the LEDs in place, a mix of orange and yellow lights, and then connect them to a switch and a battery. If you want an in-depth tutorial on how to wire lights up this way, check out the recent video by Wylock on the topic. This is where I needed some of the houses to test out how the lighting would work. I want some lights to originate inside the houses. For this tower, I want it to be a sort of lighthouse, where it shines the light from the top part. Now, if I was doing this again, I would likely design built-in holes to those buildings instead of drilling them in post-print. I'll be using this heavy cardstock to cover all the board edges, so making sure to cut out holes for the battery compartments here where needed. Now that I have some of the building placement, I start thinking about some of the other structures and getting them all planned out. I won't be gluing the rest down until they're painted, but it helps me visualize where I want the city areas to go. It helps me mark down the alleyways with a black marker so that I know what areas I want to add cobblestone texture in. At this point, I decide to add in all the boardwalks and docks to the board as well. You can see here why I painted the canal black. The docks are going to make it really hard to get into some of those places to paint. Let's add some cobblestone roads and paths throughout the city now. Pins and PVA glue, same as the canal walls from earlier. This gives me a good chance to cover up all the cabling for the LEDs as well. Now I finished sealing up all the edges of the boards so they will be smooth and protect the XPS underneath, as it's very prone to dents and gouges. Chipboard's going to be a good outer shell. I added another coat of gesso and joint compound to blend all the cobblestones into the rest of the ground now. And working this way, use lots of water to smooth out the brush strokes and stipple the texture on. Once the water settles, it'll create a natural pattern instead of the visible brush strokes. Off camera, the houses all got a coat of spray prime, and it's now time to pick their final position. And with the houses placed, it's time to start shading in light areas of the streets, getting some natural shadows by spraying from above with an airbrush. I then undertake the arduous process of hand painting over 50 individual houses. No way of automating this step now. Maybe if I get a robotic arm in the future. The roofing will be the most visible, so I spent some time coming up with some color schemes across the city. Blue, reds, and browns in the various districts. Sort of reminded me of the city of Stormwind from the game World of Warcraft. It was at this point that I wasn't too happy with the amount of brightness in the city from the LEDs I added. So I got this string of fairy lights and wanted to retrofit them in. In hindsight, I should have done all the lights this way, as it's a ton easier to wire things from underneath. Just drill down to where you want the light and poke it up from the bottom. Easy. The underside will look like a mess, but we can address that later. The battery housing and switch needed its own cavity, once again, carved out of the XPS foam here, which I added to one of the sides before sealing it with more chipboard. Now that's looking much brighter. Very nice. We're going to be doing an epoxy resin pour for the river, but before we undertake that, we need to finish up all the last minute details, such as these trees and other foliage. The tree armatures were 3D printed in resin and flocked like you would any scenic tree. Make sure you don't overcure these, leaving them a bit flexible so they don't break and snap. I also printed some statues, fountains, and little tiny boats that will go on the canal once the epoxy cures. For the rest of the ground texture, I used a mix of sand, tile grout, sawdust flock, and foam flock. The color really adds a lot of life back into the city. I sprayed in some dark wash to unify all the colors and give some recessed shading to the paint scheme as well at this point, making sure to dab off excess from the roofs. Okay, the moment we've been dreading, the epoxy resin pour for the canals. I was ambitious and wanted a live edge on all 4 sides, which would come back to bite me, because I vastly underestimated the amount of sealing I would need to stop the epoxy from leaking. My initial pour cost me a day of waiting and some cleanup of a lot of resin. Second time around, I treated the epoxy resin like I was pouring water into the canals. It needed to be a watertight seal. Water can find any small crevice and work its way through. To get that, I opted to use some clear silicone on all the gaps. There's no way I could get leaks with that, right? Let's hope for the best. Over 2 days later, and a lot of monitoring the edges to make sure they don't leak, it's time to peel back the tape. Working at this scale was refreshing, and I think I will build more for it in the future. Let me know what you think of the city, and as always, I'll catch you on the next one.